On the south shore of Long Island stands a large house with a very distinct appearance that has become etched into the collective nightmare of the American public. Located at 112 Ocean Avenue in the quiet suburban town of Amityville, New York, this Dutch colonial home features 2 quarter-round windows on the top floor that look ominously like eyes staring out into the street. For decades, this structure has been the subject of intense debate, speculation, and terror. While the architecture itself is quite beautiful and typical for the affluent neighborhood, the history contained within its walls is anything but ordinary. It is a place where reality fractures and the darkest aspects of the human psyche seem to merge with something supernatural and malevolent. The story of the haunting begins with a very real and gruesome tragedy that took place in November of the year 1974. The DeFeo family lived in the house at that time, enjoying the upper middle class lifestyle that the area provided. However, on the night of November 13th, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Although strangely, no neighbors reported hearing the shots. Inside the house, 6 members of the DeFeo family had been systematically executed in their beds with a .35 caliber lever-action Marlin rifle. The victims were Ronald DeFeo, Sr., his wife Louise, and 4 of their children. They were all found lying face down in their beds, with no signs of struggle or sedatives in their systems. The only survivor of this massacre was the eldest son, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. He initially tried to blame the murders on a mob hitman, but the police quickly found inconsistencies in his story. After intense interrogation, Ronald DeFeo Jr. confessed to killing his entire family. His defense at the trial would later claim insanity, stating that he heard voices in the house telling him to kill. He claimed that dark hands handed him the rifle and commanded him to execute his parents and siblings, while the court found him guilty and sentenced him to 6 consecutive life sentences. The notion of voices commanding violence planted a seed of dread about the property that would soon grow into a legend. Following the horrific murders, the large house on Ocean Avenue sat empty for over a year. The realty agents had a difficult time marketing a home where such a gruesome mass murder had occurred. The price was dropped significantly to tempt buyers who might be willing to overlook the tragic history for a chance to live in such a grand waterfront property. The listing described it as a charming home with a boathouse and a heated swimming pool. But it failed to mention the blood that had stained the floors and mattresses just months prior. The house waited in silence as the seasons changed, holding its secrets within the wood and plaster, waiting for a new family to cross the threshold. In December of 1975, a young couple named George and Kathleen Lutz began looking for a new home to start their life together. They had a blended family with 3 3 young children named Daniel Christopher and Melissa. When the real estate agent showed them the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, they were immediately taken by its size and amenities. The price was incredibly low at $80,000, which was a steal for such a prestigious location. The agent was honest about the DeFeo murders, but George and Kathleen Lutz decided that the past was in the past. They believed that houses do not have memories, and they purchased the property with high hopes. The Lutz family moved into their new home on December 18th, 1975. It was a cold winter day, and they spent their time unpacking boxes and assigning rooms to the children. They were determined to fill the house with love and laughter, to wash away the grim history of the DeFeo family. However, almost immediately, upon entering, the atmosphere seemed heavy. The family dog, a Malamute named Harry, refused to go near certain areas of the house and would bark at empty corners. George Lutz felt a strange chill that the heating system could not chase away. They tried to ignore these initial warning signs, attributing them to the stress of moving and the cold New York winter. Because they were a religious family, Kathleen Lutz insisted on having the house blessed by a priest. They invited Father Ralph Pecoraro to perform the blessing while they were unpacking. As the priest went upstairs to the room that had formerly belonged to Mark and John DeFeo, he began to sprinkle holy water and recite prayers. According to the priest, he heard a deep and masculine voice clearly say the words, "Get out." He felt a slap across his face, even though no one was there. He quickly left the house and told the Lutzes to never sleep in that specific room. But he did not tell them the full extent of the terror he had experienced. The first few nights in the house were uneasy, but the real terror began to manifest slowly. George Lutz found himself waking up every single night at exactly 3:15 in the morning. This was a specific time that held a dark significance, because it was the estimated time that the DeFeo murders had taken place. George would wake up feeling an intense cold and an urge to check on the boathouse. He would go downstairs and stare out into the dark water, feeling a strange connection to the tragedy that had occurred a year prior. He began to feel a sense of dread that he could not explain, and his personality started to shift. Strange phenomena began to occur throughout the house that defied logical explanation. Cold spots appeared in the hallways and living room areas, where the temperature would drop drastically within a few feet. The family began to notice strange odors that would come and go without a source. Sometimes it smelled like heavy perfume, and other times it smelled like rotting excrement or old blood. These smells would permeate a room and then vanish as quickly as they appeared. The heating system was constantly running, yet the house remained unnaturally cold, forcing the family to wear winter coats inside and light fires in the fireplace constantly. George Lutz, who was known as a hardworking and tidy man, began to neglect his business and his personal hygiene. He stopped showering and shaving, and he spent hours sitting in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames. He became sullen and aggressive, snapping at his wife and stepchildren. This behavioral change mirrored the descent of Ronald DeFeo Jr., who was also known to be moody and volatile before the murders. Kathleen Lutz was terrified by the change in her husband, but she was also dealing with her own frightening experiences. She felt as though she was being watched constantly whenever she was alone in a room. Despite it being the middle of winter, a swarm of houseflies appeared in the sewing room on the second floor. Hundreds of flies covered the window, and the walls buzzing loudly. George Lutz killed them with a rolled-up newspaper and cleaned the room, but they returned the very next day in equal numbers. This was biologically impossible, given the freezing temperatures outside. The flies seemed to be attracted to that specific room, which was one of the bedrooms where the DeFeo children had been murdered. The presence of the insects added a layer of filth and decay to the house that no amount of cleaning could remove. Kathleen Lutz began to experience physical assaults from an unseen force. She would be sitting in the kitchen or the living room and suddenly feel a sensation like a burning hand gripping her arm or waist. When she checked her skin, she found red welts that looked like burns or scratches. These marks would appear instantly and fade hours later. She also reported being touched intimately by invisible hands, which caused her immense distress. The fear in the house was becoming palpable, affecting every member of the family. But they felt paralyzed and unable to leave, as if the house was keeping them there. The youngest daughter, Melissa, who was often called Missy, began talking to an imaginary friend she named Jody. At first, the parents thought this was just a coping mechanism for the move, but Missy described Jody in disturbing detail. She said Jody was an angel who could change shapes. Sometimes Jody looked like a little boy, and other times Jody looked like a large pig. Missy claimed that Jody told her that they were going to live in the house forever. The connection between the child and this entity grew stronger, and Missy would spend hours playing in her room, talking to the empty air. One evening, George and Kathleen looked out into the yard and saw two glowing red eyes staring back at them from the darkness. When they went to investigate, they found nothing but pig tracks in the snow, even though there were no farms nearby. On another occasion, George looked up at the window of Missy's bedroom and saw the pig face staring down at him. The entity known as Jody was becoming more bold and visible. Missy stated that Jody said George was going to kill them all, which terrified Kathleen and drove a deeper wedge between the couple. The psychological pressure was mounting with each passing hour. Poltergeist activity began to escalate violently. Windows would slam shut on their own with enough force to shatter the glass. Doors would be torn off their hinges or slam locked, trapping people inside rooms. On one occasion, the front door was ripped open with such force that the doorframe was damaged. George would hear the sound of a marching band playing in the living room in the middle of the night. But when he went downstairs, the room was silent and empty. The furniture would move on its own, sliding across the wooden floors when no one was looking. One night, George walked into the living room and saw a massive beast shaped like a lion with a heavy mane. The creature was staring at him, and he fell backward in terror. When he looked again, the beast was gone, but the furniture near where it had been standing was overturned. The line between hallucination and reality was completely blurred. George was questioning his sanity, but the shared experiences of the family confirmed that something external was tormenting them. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger as they became weaker and more terrified. In the basement of the house, behind a movable bookcase, Harry, the dog, discovered a hidden room that was not on the blueprints. It was a small red painted room that smelled of blood and decay. The dog refused to go near it and cowered in fear. George named this room the Red Room. He claimed that he felt an overwhelming sense of evil emanating from this small space. Some theories later suggested this might have been a site for black magic or a portal of some kind. But at the time, it just served as another source of inexplicable terror for the beleaguered family. The horror reached a new peak when Kathleen Lutz began to undergo physical transformations. George witnessed his wife aging decades. In a matter of seconds, her hair turning white and her face becoming covered in wrinkles and hag-like features. Even more terrifying were the nights when she would levitate off the bed. George described waking up to see Kathleen floating a foot above the mattress, moving slowly toward the open window. He would have to grab her and pull her back down to the bed. She had no memory of these events, but would wake up exhausted and in pain. The family tried to contact the police and their priest multiple times, but they claimed that the phone lines were plagued with static whenever they tried to call out for help. It seemed as though the house was isolating them from the outside world. When friends did visit, they felt ill and uncomfortable, often leaving abruptly. The isolation compounded the terror, making the Lutzes feel as though they were alone in a battle against a demonic force. The house on Ocean Avenue had become a prison, and the warden was an entity that wanted to destroy them. One of the most chilling auditory hallucinations occurred when the family heard the sound of a front door slamming and heavy boots walking up the stairs. George grabbed a knife and waited at the top of the landing, expecting an intruder. The footsteps stopped right in front of him, but there was no one there. He could hear heavy breathing right in his face, but he was staring at empty air. The psychological warfare was relentless, depriving them of sleep and keeping them in a state of constant adrenaline and panic. They were reaching their breaking point. Green slime began to ooze from the walls in the hallway and from the keyholes of the doors. It was a gelatinous substance that smelled of rot. George tried to wipe it away, but it would return within hours. The porcelain toilet bowl in the downstairs bathroom turned entirely black on the inside, as if it had been burned or stained by a corrosive acid. No amount of scrubbing could clean it. The physical corruption of the house mirrored the corruption of the family unit. The environment was toxic, and it was becoming clear that their lives were in danger. The final night was a cacophony of terror that the Lutz family has never fully described in detail, claiming it is too traumatic. A violent storm raged outside, and the temperature in the house dropped to freezing. The walls seemed to groan and shake, as if the house was coming alive. George saw a hooded figure standing on the staircase, pointing at him. Furniture was banging against the walls, and the children were screaming in their beds. It was a total assault on their senses, and they knew that if they stayed one moment longer, they would not survive the night. On January 14th, 1976, after only 28 days in the house, the Lutz family fled in terror. They left all their possessions behind, including their clothes, food, and furniture. They grabbed only a few essentials and piled into their van, speeding away from Ocean Avenue without looking back. They felt that the evil entity was right on their heels until they crossed the town line. They moved in with Kathleen's mother and refused to ever return to the property to retrieve their belongings. They sent a moving company later to empty the house. The story of their flight and the haunting quickly became a media sensation. The local news picked up the story, and soon the entire country was talking about the Amityville Horror. Skeptics immediately attacked the Lutz family, accusing them of fabricating the story for money or fame. However, the Lutzes maintained their story, passing polygraph tests and enduring intense scrutiny. They seemed genuinely traumatized, and their primary goal appeared to be warning others about the evil that resided in the house. The debate between believers and skeptics began to rage. Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous demonologists, were called in to investigate the house shortly after the Lutzes fled. They arrived with a team of reporters and psychics to conduct a seance and determine the nature of the haunting. Lorraine Warren, who was a clairvoyant, claimed that she felt an overwhelming demonic presence as soon as she entered. She stated that the spirit was not human, but something ancient and inhuman. She felt the suffering of the DeFeo family and saw visions of the bodies covered in white sheets. During the investigation, the team experienced physical attacks. One of the photographers felt his chest being compressed and struggled to breathe. Another team member fainted. Lorraine Warren panicked during the seance in the living room, claiming she had made contact with the demonic force. She described it as a black swirling mass that wanted to possess them. Ed Warren was physically pushed to the floor in the basement. The investigation concluded that the house was indeed infested with a demonic entity, and they blessed the house, although they believed the evil was too strong to be fully removed. One of the most famous pieces of evidence to come from the Warren investigation was a photograph taken by Jean Campbell. The camera was set up on the second floor landing, designed to take pictures automatically throughout the night. When the film was developed, one frame showed a small boy peering out from a bedroom doorway. The boy had glowing eyes and looked remarkably like one of the murdered DeFeo children. The Lutz children were not in the house at the time. This photo remains one of the most controversial and famous ghost photos in history, despite the compelling testimony from the Lutzes, and the Warrens' allegations of a hoax persisted. William Weber, the defense attorney for Ronald DeFeo Jr., claimed that he and the Lutzes had concocted the story over many bottles of wine to help with DeFeo's insanity plea and to make money from a book deal. He stated that they took real details from the murders and exaggerated them into ghost stories. This confession from Weber cast a long shadow over the validity of the haunting, and many people dismissed the entire event as a fraud. However, the Lutz family sued Weber for invasion of privacy and maintained until their deaths that the haunting was real. George and Kathleen admitted that some parts of the book written by J. Anson were dramatized by the author, but they insisted the core events were true. They pointed out that they abandoned a large financial investment and their personal belongings, which is not the behavior of scammers. Their son, Christopher, later confirmed that he experienced terrifying things in the house. Although he disagreed with some of the more sensational elements of the book, researchers began looking into the history of the land to find a cause for the evil. Some claimed that the Shinnecock Indians had used the land as an exposure ground for the sick, and the mad leaving them to die on the site. However, local historical societies disputed this, stating that the Shinnecock lived much further east. Another theory suggested that a man named John Ketchum, who had been forced out of Salem, Massachusetts, for practicing witchcraft, had lived on the land in the 17th century. Legend said he was buried somewhere on the property. The legend of John Ketchum stated that he had built a cottage on the site and performed dark rituals involving sacrifices. Believers think that his remains are still in the earth, fueling the demonic energy that infected the DeFeo family and the Lutz family. Whether or not Ketchum actually lived there is a matter of historical debate, but the story adds a layer of ancient evil to the narrative, suggesting that the house itself was just a vessel for something that had been in the soil for centuries. Today, the house still stands on Ocean Avenue, but the address has been changed to confuse tourists and discourage trespassers. The iconic quarter-round windows have been replaced with square ones to alter the appearance of the home. Several families have lived there since the Lutzes, and none have reported any paranormal activity. They claim it is a beautiful and peaceful home. This silence from subsequent owners is the strongest argument for skeptics who believe the haunting was either a hoax or a psychological projection of the Lutz family. Yet the psychological toll on the people involved cannot be ignored. Ronald DeFeo Jr. died in prison in 2021, still claiming that voices drove him to murder. George and Kathleen Lutz both passed away, maintaining their story. The trauma inflicted on that property, whether supernatural or human, left deep scars. The image of the house with the eye windows remains a symbol of fear, representing the idea that our safe havens can turn against us. It taps into the primal fear of the home becoming a place of danger. The Amityville Horror spawned a massive franchise of books and movies, cementing its place in pop culture. The story terrified a generation and changed the way people looked at old houses. It brought the concept of demonic haunting into the mainstream conversation. While the truth may never be fully known, the story serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that some places hold memories and energies that we cannot explain, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we cannot see. Ultimately, the story of 112 Ocean Avenue is a ghost story that defies simple categorization. It is a mix of true crime, mass murder, psychological breakdown, and alleged supernatural infestation. Whether one believes in demons or not, the horror of what happened to the DeFeo family is undeniably real. The subsequent story of the Lutz family adds a layer of myth that has made the house immortal. It stands as a dark monument to the unknown. As night falls over Long Island and the fog rolls in off the water, the house sits silent. The current owners may sleep soundly, but the legend ensures that the world will always watch that property with suspicion. The dread lingers in the minds of those who know the story. We are left wondering if the evil is truly gone, or if it is merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to wake up again. The Amityville Horror remains an open wound in the history of American hauntings, a mystery that may never be solved.